This is Asha Dore with Totally Biased Reviews for Parley Lit, talking with Susan Shapiro about her memoir, The Forgiveness Tour. Originally published in 2021, the paperback came out this year.
So I'm Susan Shapiro, and I'm a longtime writing professor who's the author of many books my family hates, including 5 Men Who Broke My Heart, Lighting Up, and my recent memoir, The Forgiveness Tour. It originally came out in hardcover right in the middle of the pandemic. So unfortunately, it was really frustrating because it took me 10 years to work on this book and finish it and publish it. And then it kind of died because I couldn't do in-person events, which I love to do. And I also, there was very little TV things happening, and of course the pandemic took over everything. So interestingly, it got very good reviews, which gave me hope. And then I did a bunch of other book projects in a row, and then I was able to talk my publisher into doing a paperback, and that just came out. That just came out recently. So what's exciting now is I'm kind of making up for lost time and doing all kinds of in-person events. And I did TV and radio and traveling. So and interestingly, the world is in such a worse place, I think, than it was a few years ago, that it becomes, I think, even more relevant between all the political divisiveness and the wars going on, and family fights, and so in a weird way, part of my argument to the publisher was that this is even a better time to put it out.
In your words, why should somebody read this book?
Well, so it was a story where I felt insulted and slighted by somebody very important in my life who refused to acknowledge they did anything wrong and would not apologize. And even though I think I'm a very forgiving person, I found that I could not forgive somebody who didn't say they were sorry. And so I guess it's a book for anyone who's ever felt wronged or slighted by someone that couldn't apologize or that didn't get apologized. And I actually not only interviewed a lot of religious figures to ask about the whole concept of forgiveness and when you should forgive and when you shouldn't forgive, but I also interviewed 13 people who had huge, horrible wrongs done to them that were never righted, about how they healed and whether or not an apology or reparation helped them heal. So so I sort of broadened the conversation. So it started out a memoir, but it kind of became, a prescriptive meditation on apologies and forgiveness. And really, I'm very psychoanalytic. So the question that was always on my mind was, should you forgive somebody who doesn't apologize or who doesn't give you the apology you need? And I actually just wrote a piece for the Washington Post about when it's healthier not to apologize, when it's healthier not to forgive somebody. So, it's, I mean, there's this whole forgiveness industry that seems to imply like radical forgiveness, forgive everybody, everything. And it turns out that's bullshit.
Yeah, I really can, that resonates with me too. And I'm interested, I'm interested in so many parts of it. Definitely in, the people that you interviewed, there are some people just experience like a really bad cheating situation or like their partner leaving them. And some people experience loss of their entire, community, country, family, like really horrible tragedies. I was really compelled by all the different ways that they saw forgiveness or non-forgiveness. And I just wondered if you had anything to say about what that was like and if you learned anything through the process of interviewing these people that was different from other books.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I definitely did a lot. Well, to tell the truth, it started out as a memoir, and I had people read it and they just said, this is too myopic, New York, idiosyncratic, shrinky. Nobody wants to read this, because it started out just being about my own story, which was, falling out with a mentor, which is kind of, very non-dramatic in a way because it happens to everybody. So, but I knew there was something there. And you always, when you write a memoir, I mean, as a memoir teacher, I always, even with essays, I always ask my students, who's your audience? And what's the big question? What's the bigger question aside from yourself that you're trying to ponder? So in my first memoir, 5 Men Who Broke My Heart, it was, how do you know if you wound up with the right person? And the second book, Lighting Up, was, what if every time you quit one addiction, you get addicted to something else? And so this book, what I thought about was the real question, the universal question was, should you forgive someone who doesn't apologize? So that was the larger question. And I had a friend who's actually a Pulitzer Prize winning historian who read the first draft, and he agreed that it was too small to wrap a whole book around, but he had read the co-authored book that I did with Kenan Trabincevic, The Bosnia List, and he said, "Now why don't you go ask Kenan what he thinks about forgiveness?" Now that's somebody who, was a Bosnian Muslim victim of ethnic cleansing. Let's see what he says to, what does he have to say about forgiveness? And then he knew that the historian knew that I was very friendly with a Holocaust survivor. And he said, go ask the Holocaust survivor who got reparations from Germany and did get an apology. Did it mean anything? And I had told him the story about a student of mine who was raped by her father, and she had written about it. And he said, go ask her about forgiveness, because she was coerced by her Baptist clergy to forgive the father who had raped her. And then he tried again. So the historian, from his standpoint, he basically said, your story is small. Now, why don't you go interview people who have enormous, huge, dramatic, horrible things that have happened to them that have really grappled with, on a much deeper and darker and tragic level, what it means to, to be wronged and never have something righted. There was a man in Michigan who forgave the drunk driver who killed his wife and 2 children. Mm-hmm. So basically my attitude was, I didn't know how small my story was yet at the beginning, but the more that I interviewed people, the more that I interviewed people who had, enormous wrongs in their life that were never righted, the more it put what happened to me in perspective. And actually, in sharing their wisdom, they just gave me so many nuanced ideas and fascinating feelings and thoughts about the nature of, forgiveness and, and when is it appropriate to forgive, and does it ever help? Does apology ever help? Do reparations ever help? So that was how it began. And I definitely was interested in, I was teaching at Holy Apostle Soup Kitchen. I was teaching a writing group. And so I asked the Reverend there, who I was close to. And so she gave me the Christian point of view. And then I asked all the rabbis I knew, both Orthodox, conservative, Reform. And then I had a Muslim cleric I asked, and a friend, an Indian American friend, introduced me to her Swami. So I really broadened it. And yeah, I was surprised by a lot of things. I mean, one thing that interested me was that basically in Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, much as it seems as if they're all for forgiveness, if you read carefully, they're really only for forgiveness once you repent. Mm-hmm. So, and that's also the basis of a lot of legal cases. Does somebody apologize, and do they have remorse? Mm-hmm. So that really interested me, because my feelings weren't so far off, because my initial feeling was, if you can't apologize, I don't think I could forgive you. And that's actually pretty fair. On the other hand, with Hinduism and with Buddhism, they sort of seem to feel that there was a larger overview. And the implication was kind of like, try to get out of your own little human foibles and see a bigger overview. And that was interesting too. And actually, there was a Hindu doctor who gave me advice that kind of unlocked me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really liked that chapter. How
Thank you.
How did you know when you had enough interviews, or like, how did you know when to stop collecting advice?
Yeah, well, what's interesting was I was so upset that basically everyone I talked to, and a lot of people knew the therapist who I write about, because I had written an earlier book about him, and he was sort of part of my world in the village. So a lot of people would say, how is he? Are you still seeing him? What's going on? And so anytime anybody would ask, I would tell them what happened to me and how upset I was not getting an apology. And even without me asking, it seemed to lead to people telling me their own stories about getting slighted, or how somebody never apologized to them when they thought they owed them an apology. So interestingly, people were sort of telling me their stories, and I started taking notes. And at a certain point, I mean, I certainly love like Studs Terkel's oral histories, and so I was sort of, part of me wondered whether I should do it that way. So I started taking notes and asking more questions, and sort of just writing lists of the stories that people were telling me. And what I realized was that I had a really interesting range. So then I decided to, out of all the stories that I was being told, I wanted to pick 13 stories that were, each one would be different. And I definitely wanted it to be very diverse because I didn't want it to just be like, I'm a
Mhm.
middle-aged Jewish woman. So I didn't want only to have people like me. And then, of course, Kenan was a younger Muslim, Bosnian Muslim. And then my friend, one of the people that I wrote about was a Kashmiri poet. And the woman, Charisse, who had written about her own story, she was African American and younger than me and a mom of four. So I think when I was going over all the stories, I kind of felt like I wanted it to be universal, and I wanted to show that I wanted to show a very wide range, and I especially wanted to choose people from different religions because I thought maybe they would have something new to teach me, which they did. Which they did. Every person that had a different background or spirituality definitely had a different way of looking at it. So I really wanted to examine the idea of, should you forgive someone who doesn't apologize? That was really the question. And what does your religion say? And what does your story say? Your own, what do your feelings say about that based on what you experienced? And so I sort of put the equation into each of the 13 people that I chose.
Mhm. Yeah, I like that. And did the question of the book change for you while you were doing the interviews, or did it stay pretty solid?
Well, the first question that I had myself, I mean, I was really upset by that situation because this was somebody who I'd come to depend on for 15 years, and he was my guru. And so, it was like anytime that I would have like a huge, horrible conundrum in my life, I would go to him. So all of a sudden, I couldn't go to him. I think very early on, the question for me was because he had been kind and important in my life, very, very important, helped me get off of alcohol and drugs and cigarettes, and helped me publish books and helped me with my marriage, really helped get me married, which I'd written about before. So I think my biggest question was, so somebody had been kind to me and very important in my life for 15 years. So I wanted to forgive him. I didn't want to hold a grudge or fight at all. So very early on, the question was, how do I get over this? How do I forgive? If he can't say I'm sorry and he doesn't think he did anything wrong, what do I do with that? Like,
Mhm.
if somebody screws me up, and it's happened obviously a million times in my life, but they can just say, boy, I screwed up, I'm so sorry, it's pretty easy for me to forgive.
Mhm.
But if somebody doesn't even think they did something wrong, I just didn't know what to do with that. So really that was the initial question, and it stayed throughout, and actually it got more and more interesting, asking religious leaders and people who had wrongs never righted, um, you know, asking them how they felt only illuminated what an interesting question it is. And there's really no black and white answer. In fact, as I said, that, there seems to be almost a movement now with people talking about how it's actually healthier in many cases to not forgive.
Mhm.
So it's, even if somebody apologizes, because just for an example, I interviewed uh, an LA psychologist, Dr. Omani, who's the author of It's Not You, and she talked about recidivism. And when it comes to abuse, she basically said she's never seen a case where somebody doesn't do it again.
Mhm.
So it's, so there's just really interesting, there just kept being more and more interesting things to talk about and to analyze. I talk very clearly about 4 elements of a successful, effective apology. So
Mhm.
it's number one, verbalizing that you're sorry for specifically what you did wrong. Number two, explaining why it happened. Number three, showing how it'll never happen again. And number four, offering a reparation to fix it.
Mhm. Mhm.
So it's very rare that somebody gets a full-fledged apology, first off. And then what I also found interesting was in people who got full-fledged apologies, there was still a lot of ambivalence. For example, the Holocaust survivor, I mean, Germany did officially apologize to Jews for, murdering 6 million, and they offered reparations. And on one hand, he said, Manny Mandel, he said he thrived in life out of spite and never forgave. On the other hand, the reparation meant a lot to his family. And so there was a part of me that started thinking, when I looked over all the stories, sometimes the reparation is the most important part because it empowers someone to move on. And then Gary Weinstein, who I just did an event with at Temple Israel in Michigan, so he forgave the drunk driver who killed his wife and 2 kids. And when we analyzed that story, that was a story where he saw that alcoholism is a disease. The man, publicly, you know, completely 100% apologized. And Gary got reparations. The man went to jail. The whole community stood by him. So I
Mhm.
wondered, did that make it a little bit easier? Because what about, for example, with Charisse, her father raped her, and then a clergy pushes her to forgive him, and then he tries again, and
Mhm.
there's no crowd of people, there's no therapist, there's nobody helping her understand that she didn't have to forgive him, and that by forgiving him might have set herself up for more harm. So that's a very different story. And actually, what was fascinating to me was in her 40s when I did the interview, her dad died, so she basically posthumously unforgave him and found that extremely liberating and empowering because it was her agency. She made a decision.
Mhm. Like, it's very hard for people to hear that you don't forgive someone.
There's a new direction that's happening in this exact arena. In fact, there are 3 or 4 new books that kind of imply you don't have to forgive, and I think that it's changing. I think the tides are turning
Mhm.
when it comes to this kind of stuff. And actually, one of the biggest memoirs of the last few years has been "I'm Glad My Mom Died."
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was, and it sounded like the mother was really abusive.
Mhm.
And so I think that it's becoming. I think that maybe in the, I don't know, 60s, 70s, there's this hippy dippy, forgive everybody, everything kind of attitude. And I think that more recently, there's been a backlash against that. And also when there's wars going on, and protests on every college campus, and, divisive politics in every family, I think it's people are understandably more self-protective and also more weary of toxic things that are going to hurt them
Mhm.
or hurt their family. So I do think the impulse towards self protection is more important.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's really interesting because, I think I mean, this might just be because this is the year and this is the day that I'm talking about it, but it seems like more and more ideas are very like black and white. It's very divisive. And, this book it kind of cracks open in the questions that you have in it. It kind of, there's a lot of answers. It doesn't seem like there's one thing to land on. But I wonder if there's something that you hope that your reader walks away from this
Yeah,
book.
it's an interesting question. So a lot of people say to me, so after you spent 10 years on this, did it make you more forgiving? And the answer is no, but it did make me much more likely to give a good apology if I screw up. So I think there's a part of me that feels like if somebody takes anything away from reading the book, it's that there are some people who wait their whole life for an appropriate apology, and it's extremely important. And the fact that sometimes we have the power to heal someone we care about with words, so there is a part of me that feels like maybe what you want to come away with is not that you should forgive everybody everything. It's a very, very nuanced situation where every slight and every person and every background, and every apology and every kind of forgiveness is different. But I do think, um, if there's one universal truth, it's that apologizing, expressing regret, and trying to make it up to somebody that you screwed up, I think that's always a good thing. Even
Mhm.
if they don't accept your apology, I still think it could be healing for someone to hear you admit what you did, black and white, and fall on your sword and stop arguing and stop being defensive and stop giving, like, passive aggressive apologies like, I'm sorry if I hurt you. I mean, at one point, my mentor said to me, I'm sorry for the invisible crime you think I committed. And
Ugh.
that made me want to commit a real crime.
Yeah, I
But
bet.
so I do think that if you come away with anything from the book, time and time again in each story, the apology that someone desperately wanted and sometimes received, with all 4 elements, the 4 fledged apologies seem to be extremely important. And again, you have the power. If you hurt somebody, even if it was unintentional, or even if you don't believe that you hurt someone, but someone in your life is coming to you and telling you they're hurt. And this, by the way, there's this whole estranged children movement on TikTok where kids are deciding that they no longer want to have any contact with their parents. And I've actually had several students on both levels, parents and kids, come to me and write about and talk about those kind of stories. One of the things that I say to the parent, because a lot of times the parent will come to me and they'll say, I tried my best. And okay, so I got divorced. It wasn't my fault. And okay, I was working all the time, but why are they blaming me? And they're so defensive. And what I say is, if you want to bridge the gap, if you want to reconnect and get rid of the estrangement, don't keep defending yourself. Why don't you start with asking them how they feel? and asking them how they perceived what happened to them. There's actually a really good book on The Good Apology by Molly Howe, where she talks about that, how the first step shouldn't be you defending yourself. It should be, tell me how you feel, tell me what I did, tell me how you experienced it. And even if you disagree, keep your mouth shut and listen. And when they're done talking, say, I am so sorry. Like, fall on your sword. Don't defend yourself. Don't justify what you did. Don't give explanations. Just, put yourself in the shoes of someone you care about who felt this hurt or felt slighted, or felt traumatized by something that you did, even if you weren't conscious of it, or you don't think they should have. That's not the story. The story is, do you want to heal this? And so I think it's really important to look at situations in your own life and realize you might have the power to unlock it just by listening and apologizing. And also, if you don't know what to say, aside from I'm sorry, say, what can I do to fix this? That's so much of a better thing to say than justifying what you did or saying, oh, I had no idea. Say, what can I do to fix this? Because quite often someone will tell you.
Hmm. Yeah, that's something that I really liked in your book too, is that, you don't spend the whole time just being the person who needs the apology. Like, you moved through different spaces where, you recognize like your impact on different people. And I think that that's really interesting because it does seem like it's sort of like a litany of impact across the 13 chapters.
At the end, once I saw the real power that an apology can have, I went on my own forgiveness binge and I apologized to everybody who I screwed up with fascinating results, I thought. When I quit addictions, I did not quit through AA meetings. I didn't do meetings. So the way that I quit addictions was I quit with individual one-on-one therapy with an addiction specialist. So amends weren't really part of what I did. But the reason why addiction became important in this book was, first off, so the falling out was with my addiction specialist. So my biggest fear at the beginning was that I was going to relapse, because this was a person who was my higher power, who held everything together. So that maybe there was an urgency and a desperation to solve the conundrum of forgiving him, because if I didn't, there was a lot at stake. It seemed like if I didn't figure it out and I kept being upset and it got worse, then I would start drinking or smoking or doing drugs again, which was, my worst nightmare because I'd been clean and sober for a long time. So that gave it an edge. And then, interestingly, not intentionally, but a bunch of the stories that I stumbled on all had to do with addiction. So for example, Gary Weinstein, and I saw his story in a documentary called Transforming Loss. But so he's talking about how a drunk driver, this driver was clean and sober for like 19 years and then screwed up, and his family was about to give him an intervention. And before they could do it, he got in a car drunk and killed 3 people. So addiction reared its head then. And then there was another story where a man was talking about a wife who screwed up his entire family, and it was because she was an addict and could never get clean and sober, and still isn't clean and sober. So it's interesting that the issue of addiction kept circling around, and it was sort of prevalent in a bunch of the stories.
Yeah, it really is, because I think that one of the hardest things about addiction is that it's, because it's a disease and it's a behavioral thing sometimes, and because there's such an impact on other people, it's really hard to find the location of the responsibility. And a lot
Right.
of people, I think, have a hard time even being mad at their loved ones. I've had a hard time with people who've been addicted, like even really being able to hold them to account.
By the way, it's an interesting question which comes up a few times in the book, because there are people who have cancer who say, I have a disease and it's, that doesn't justify me,
Hmm.
not taking care of myself, not doing everything I can to fix it. And so they resent the fact that some people say, well, I'm a drug addict or I'm an alcoholic and that's a disease, as if you have no control because it's not a disease like cancer. I mean, someone who has cancer, never did anything, quite often never did anything at all in their life unhealthy and wound up with it. So, it's an interesting question.
Hmm. Yeah, it's
You
really tricky.
yeah, like, okay, on one hand, it's a disease. On the other hand, it's one of the rare diseases where you actually have a choice. It's a little bit different than other kinds of illnesses that you really have no control no matter what you do.
Hmm. Yeah, it's really like a profoundly big gray area. I think so many
Yeah,
different.
I mean, I would say, and that was really the conclusions that I kept coming to in the book. Like, I think, it seemed as if with this whole forgiveness industry, the implication was, radically forgive everybody, everything. And it turns out, it turns out every single story is different. There's all kinds of nuances. There's no generalization that works. There's no blanket reason for exoneration in the world, that you really have to look at every slight and every hurt, put it under a microscope in a different way. And you have to, there's a lot of things you have to understand about the people that are involved and about the stakes and about what could fix it. No two people are alike. I mean, what was interesting to me, which I analyzed in the book, was why could Gary forgive the drunk driver who killed his wife and two children, yet one of the stories of the wife could not forgive her husband for leaving her.
Mhm.
So that's interesting, because one would think that it was a little bit of a lesser crime.
Mhm.
I guess it was a crime of the heart. But then when I came to analyze it, a lot of it had to do with how loved a person felt growing up, how solid their family was, their past, a lot of things in their past. So people who felt very loved in childhood um, were able to forgive much faster, and
Mhm.
people who came from dysfunctional families where they didn't felt loved kind of lumped everything in with, see, this is the story of my life, and held grudges. So
Mhm.
that's interesting too. And it actually made me feel happy that I'd been in therapy, because people who had, I mean, happier people who had better lives, better relationships, were much more able to forgive and move on. And
Mhm.
the people who got stuck in the past usually were people who, um, you know, had other things from their past that they hadn't dealt with. And it's sort of the new slight kind of combined with old slights, and it kind of screwed them up.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's interesting. I feel like a lot of our cultural conversation is about, like these attachment styles, attachment disorders, and just the way that we like carry on these patterns of attachment. So that really resonates with that. And it's also interesting because I feel like this book is kind of like the antithesis to the way that we conduct cultural conversations. Like just having to it sort of requires you to go directly into the moment that you're in with all of the complexity that's there, which I think is a very difficult thing for people to even hold in their minds, much less practice, in like a cultural way, like a large scale way. So I think it's really, really interesting that you were able to put this in a book and in such an organized way.
Well,
And
it took 10 years.
yeah.
And there were certain things that were going on in terms of the structure that was the way my mind works, and also what I learned in therapy. So for example, one of the things that the therapist had told me a long time ago, which I kept coming back to, was you can't expect anything from unhappy people, because they have nothing to give, because they have to shore up all their energy to take care of themselves. So
Mhm.
that came up a lot, because the people who couldn't forgive tended to be unhappy.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
also, he said something to me a long time ago that stayed with me, which is, he said he absolutely thought people can change. And in his 30 years of therapy with addiction and other problems, he said there were 3 times that he has seen people like really change, like really, really make huge changes. One was when someone they loved died, whether it was a parent or a child or a spouse or someone important in their life. The second one was through good love. And the third one was through therapy. So that, so I was looking through that prism also, because of course I didn't want to be like an angry person holding a vendetta forever. And I felt like, well, I'm on the fence, because I had addiction and depression, in my background, and maybe even inherited trauma. And so which way am I going to go? Am I going to be the type person who's able to forgive and get happy and move on? Or am I going to be the type person that's going to get stuck forever and never be able to get over the slights? So I definitely, kept in mind, and ultimately I was really glad that I did therapy. And what is therapy but talking about what's going on, what problems you're having, and asking for advice and asking for wisdom from other people, which was what I was doing in the book. So uh, he said to me a really good line that I liked at one point, which was when I said, "How do I stay clean and sober and successful?" Right after I was finished with the addiction therapy, he said, "Lead the least secretive life you can," and that became part of my whole um, motivation almost in writing the book was I was being really, really honest about my feelings. I was sharing them with other, I shared exactly how I felt because I was really broken. I was very down and low and scared when I started writing the book. And I shared that vulnerability, and other people shared that vulnerability with me. I'll tell you an interesting story, which is eventually when, in the book, we do reconcile. He does come back and apologize to me. And while it was going on, I, lead the least secretive life you can. So whoever asked, are you still seeing him? What's going on? I would tell the story. Say, no, we had a falling out. I would explain why we had a falling out and how upset I was and how he wouldn't apologize. And when we finally did speak, I said to him, he was very upset that I had told people what happened. And I said, is that why you're apologizing? Is that why you're coming back and telling me, that you're sorry because you want me to shut up? And he was like, yeah, shut up already. And he started
Right.
laughing. He started laughing already. And I said, are you serious? And he said, well, things coexist. But what was interesting to me is, had I not told anybody about it, he might not have felt compelled to, he wouldn't have had the motivation. If he just lost one patient who was mad at him, he probably wouldn't have had the motivation to apologize. But because we knew so many people in common, I think people had come to him and said, I heard what happened. What did you do? Why did you do that? That doesn't sound very cool. So he was getting a lot of bad feedback about it. And I think that that was part of his motivation to make the bad stuff go away and to fall on his sword and to come clean. And
Mhm.
so in actuality, he had taught me years before how to eventually deal with him.
Which that's awesome.
Right. Lead the least secretive life you can. And I, by the way, and I do think that that was also an important element of some of the apologies. So for example, Gary Weinstein, there was a man who was put in jail and it was in all the newspapers. And this was a bad guy who did a bad thing. I mean, killed a wife and two kids,
Mhm.
because he was a drunk driver, and I mean, so there was really a very big public, huge public outcry against what this person did. And in cases like that, I think people healed faster. On the other hand, in the cases where, for example, the wife whose husband left her while she was pregnant, all of a sudden he gets remarried and everybody starts taking his side as if her feelings don't even matter. And the same thing with, Charisse, after what happened with her and her father, nobody knew about it. And she felt, humiliated and betrayed, and nobody was coming to her side. And her mother stayed with her father. So it's interesting that sometimes the people who, like Kenan, for example, um, by speaking out loudly against the atrocities of what happened to him, he healed.
Mhm.
He was very empowered, by being able to talk about it, and he wrote 2 books about it, and he actually met his wife because he spoke out about it. So I thought, if there's a takeaway, lead the least secretive life you can. I think that's a good takeaway.
It's interesting to think about the way that, apologies are sanctioned sometimes. It seems like that sanctioned anger or sanctioned apology is like a really big element in
Oh,
the
it is. And by the way, and one of the things that has come up in the recent research I've done about when it's healthier not to apologize is that basically apologies and forgiveness, especially the push to grant forgiveness, that always benefits the abuser and not the abused.
yeah.
Right? Because you're somehow exonerating or pardoning someone who did something horrible, which means that they get to be lawless and that they don't get punished and they get to move on. I mean, one of the stories that I just wrote in the Washington Post is I co-authored a book with Sergeant Ekelina Ganell, who was hurt very badly when he was defending the Capitol for January 6th in the
Mhm.
insurrection. And he has fought very, very strongly to make sure that everybody that took part in it, all the court cases, he comes and he gives statements and he speaks up, and he's still doing it. And he wants them sentenced, and he wants them sentenced longer. And when I asked him about it, his attitude is that if they're forgiven, and Trump has said, I will pardon all the insurrectionists if I get into office. But if they're pardoned, then there's no punishment, and then they'll do it again, and they'll do it worse next time because there was no consequence.
Yeah.
So he feels very, very strongly that, there has to be a consequence and a punishment in order for it not to happen again. And I agree.
Yeah, it seems like it, and I really like the connections that you're drawing. When I was reading your book, I was thinking a lot about, something that I talk to my patients and students about, is just like the way that we feel in our body when certain things happen. And one thing that I've noticed just in my personal life and in my practice is that when we do sort of force an apology, force forgiveness, those kinds of forced situations or like heavily pressured sanctioned situations, the abuser seems to be like neurologically regulated. Like they
Right.
calm down. And like it seems like we teach people on like a physiological body level to be comfortable with their own bullshit if we
Right.
forgive them, and it's we're really, like, helping their nervous system while also harming our own sometimes, you know?
Right. And again, the recidivism is what's so important there. And usually, if somebody isn't punished and doesn't have to suffer for their sins, then not only is it much easier to repeat them, it's like that sometimes, you know, they can justify in their own mind they didn't even do anything wrong and continue to be lawless.
Yeah.
And that's dangerous for all of us. I mean, what if there is another insurrection? The fact that Trump and major people that perpetuated what happened on January 6th have really, nobody's been jailed. Nobody's been really even called on it. A lot of the hypocrites, who switched places are still in power, who switched their opinions are still in power. Yeah. So it's an interesting question. And I'm sure you've read The Body Keeps the Score.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think that, again, lead the least secret of life you can. And
Mhm.
by the way, that doesn't necessarily mean tell every single secret you have to everybody.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I think what it means is, like you figure out what your goals are. So, if you're in a happy marriage and you have kids and you're working for the government, then maybe you can't talk about, you can't sort of blurt out all of your, I used to do heroin stories everywhere.
Mhm.
But I think it does mean that um, you can find people you trust, confidants, or meetings or certain environments where, opening up and talking about it will be liberating for you.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. I think that authenticity is really, really super important. So are there any, like, chapters that you or scenes that you had to cut that you really liked or think about still?
I was pretty lucky because I think I kept in everything that I loved, even when people told me to take them out, I didn't.
Mhm.
So for example, there was a very early scene which actually started the book, which was, right when I figure out what's going on with my therapist and I flip my shit. And there's a scene where, I'm talking about how humiliated I feel by a former student who's half my age. And I just talk about how, I feel like a funhouse mirror has thrown me into, like this bizarre, uh, this bizarre image where I'm in denial of how old I am. And I just sort of go on this, sort of wrecking ball of, freaking out. And early on, there were people who said, take it out. Like there were people who advocated for this to be more of a, third person reported, talk about forgiveness, maybe in the way that I've done in other books, that were completely prescriptive. And so people told me to take that out. And I just felt like that's not only what inspired the book, because that was exactly, like, I can even remember it happened in 2009, and I came home and wrote that. And that's when I knew I had a book, because I just felt so passionately about it. And I brought it into my writing group, and they were, I studied with the poet Joseph Brodsky, who used to say the worst insult that he ever said for your writing was, there's no blood here. So when I wrote that scene, I just felt there's blood all over here. And so I actually was quite proud of it. And so when people told me to take it out, I just thought, I don't want to write a book where the inciting incident that I feel is the most bloody and honest is out of the book. It did take me a while to realize it doesn't have to be. If you notice, it's not the first chapter anymore. It's not the first paragraph, right? So I listened to some critics, in that there were people who felt that, they just didn't want it to be, uh, you know, if you just opened the book and started with that, even though I thought it was dramatic, maybe that didn't help me. So now I have a note to the reader first. So there's 2 pages of a note to the reader that has more of an overview about forgiveness, so that people could get a sense that, okay, this isn't a book about, a woman on the verge of a nervous breakdown necessarily, that there's a it's an idea book. So I start with the idea and sort of explain it a little bit to the reader. And then the next chapter, I sort of slowly give you the scene, but I didn't want to get rid of the scene.
Mhm. That makes sense, yeah. Um, do you have a favorite scene to read right now as you're going on your tour?
I do read that scene because it's what I love about it. I actually just did it at a reading downtown. Um, I do read that scene because what I love about it is it's about a page. So it's a very short scene and it's very intense. And it feels viscerally right. And what happens is, I started out as a confessional poet and then I switched to very personal essays and then I switched to memoir. So even though I have done journalism and a lot of this book is interviewing other people and prescriptive ideas, my heart and soul is still in the confessional. So what I love about reading that is that feels like that page scene feels like the closest to, who I am and the kind of writing I do, even though I'm glad that unlike my other books, I didn't just stay in my own myopic story. I expanded it, but I like the fact that I'm able to sort of keep the angry, crazy poem that started the whole thing is still there.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. There's definitely like a lot of like visceral, connection in that scene. Like I love how, even though I am in a totally different life, right? I can still see how that would be like such a betrayal and such a like derailing experience.
It probably was, in retrospect, it was probably a perfect storm of 20 things happening all at the same time,
Mhm.
because, I mean, just weird, interesting things, because he was a father figure and he was actually about to move away. So I was already he was moving states. So I was already having like anxiety that he was leaving. And then the student had red hair like my mother, and she was exactly half my age. So there was a lot of things that I think I had just turned 50, which was it's a hard age. So there was a lot of things that happened in that exact moment. And also that, as I write about later, that it just so happened that he was going through a really crazy, horrible time himself. And maybe our transference or something kind of crossed wires or something like that. So yeah, it was really a perfect storm. On the other hand, I got a great book out of it, and it got my only starred review in Publishers Weekly, so maybe it was worth it.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a great book. Is there anything that you want to say about your classes or what you're working on now?
Thanks. So this book just came out in paperback, and the co-authored book I mentioned, American Shields, comes out in paperback in November. So I'm doing a lot of events for those, which both of them, which is really fun. Yeah, and my during the pandemic, I started teaching online, and it turns out I love teaching online. I've taught for 25 years at NYU, the New School in Columbia, in person, and now I have these amazing classes. They're just 5 weeks, and one of them is, as you know, how to break into newspapers and magazines. And what's exciting about the online classes is I can have editors from all over Zoom in. So I'll have one class with an editor from, the LA Times op-ed, the New York Times op-ed, and the Washington Post op-ed, which I can't even do in New York in the old classes. And then I have a how to sell your first book class, and a lot of people are selling books. So it's kind of exciting to be able to, my mom said and my brother too is in IT, I'm a digital nomad, which is kind of
Mhm.
hilarious because I'm usually so sad in Greenwich Village, but now when I travel, I take two computers and I could do my classes and seminars anywhere. So that's been exciting. I'm working on a few new book projects, but I've learned not to talk about them too early.
That's fair. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it's your classes are amazing, and like the people that I've met who have taken your classes, they all have like a kind of similar energy. Very responsive, very like business oriented, and also just like really, really like generous.
Funny thing in college, I think I was called the least likely to join a cult, the most likely to start one.
It's a good
And
cult.
yeah, and I will say that, to me, because when I first moved to New York, there was a huge group affiliated with NYU, the graduate program with poets, and I just met this whole, beautiful community, and it actually got recreated when I started teaching at the New School. So I definitely promote that, that being a good literary citizen and having a community that's been extremely important to me. And I have these two amazing writing groups where we're extremely supportive of each other. So I will say that I love perpetuating that in my classes, and I tell the truth, which is, it's good karma. Like here's a story that I always tell, which is they say that if your first book is a bestseller, you're more likely to get a second book deal, but if it's not, you won't. All right. So I have 18 books and only 4 of them have been bestsellers. So how does that happen? So I truly believe it's because I have such great karma because I've helped so many other writers get published.
Mhm.
And I explain that to my students. So it's like instead of just posting your own work, if there's a classmate who has a piece that you like that just got published, post it and tweet it and say, I'm honored to know this person. And isn't this a beautiful piece? And not only are you being kind to the other person, but it makes you look better because then you don't look like a person that's just chasing after your own checks and bylines, but you look like a generous person. And so people are going to be more likely to, when you publish something to share your piece. And so I really love that about the community.
Yeah, it's really like it's really beautiful and it's so I mean for me I've gained a lot from your classes just because I think that there's a huge separation between, the literary craft world and teaching like just how to get to your story and find your voice and all that and then understanding the business and like, these sort of like commercial magazines and how to even talk to these editors and agents and all these people who have really different views than what we are taught in MFA programs and writing groups. So it's a really nice bridge between these two worlds that I think really need to know each other.
Yeah, thank you. And by the way, that's one of the things, especially with my classes, I always start telling the story how I have an undergraduate degree for 4 years from University of Michigan, 2 years NYU. I've taken years and years of other classes, and none of the teachers ever talked about how do I send out any of the work that I've now spent 10 and 15 years perfecting. Like nobody talked about it. And when I tried to ask questions, they actually looked at me like I was crazy. So what was really cool was they always say you're supposed to write the books you wanted to read and take the class, teach the class you wanted to take. So I wrote, Byline Bible and Book Bible because it's exactly what I wish somebody would have handed me right when I started. Because who knew that it doesn't matter if you're 17 or 18 or 20 or 22 or 25. It's not that hard to get published. I could teach somebody, I've taught people how to do it in like, less than 5 weeks. And you could be in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or New York Magazine or launch a book. It's not that hard to do. It's just that nobody teaches you how. So it was definitely exciting when I started teaching at the new school that they allowed me to. I said I don't want to do poetry 101, fiction 101, journalism 101, because even though I love taking a lot of writing classes, I was extremely frustrated and it took me so many years. I mean, my first book didn't come out until I was 43, and it just took me so many years to figure out, who do I send what to and how do I get paid and what might they be interested in and do I pitch it or do I sell it? Like it's just a very, very complicated world that nobody, you really have to just get in the middle of it and trial and error, and sometimes it takes years to figure it out. So, and I also felt like, I studied with amazing, Nobel Pulitzer Prize winning, National Book Award winning authors. So I also felt like, well, what can I add to this conversation? And that was the one arena where nobody was really helping. So so I sort of based my classes around that, which have been, truthfully, it makes it way more exciting.
Yeah, yeah, it's really awesome. I'm really appreciate it and I feel so much less frustrated than I have been for many years because I had a similar experience. Wonderful mentors, but it always seemed like the publishing process was just like a fairy godmother kind of thing. Like it either works for you randomly or it never does, you
Yeah,
know.
what's funny is that so I've taken to so not only teaching online, which I never thought I would be interested in because I'm a technophobe, but also it's funny, I speak so quickly. And so sometimes I'll let my students from all over the country, now all over the world, I'll have conversations at night and I'll let them ask me questions. And it's so interesting because people just, I mean, like 20 and 30 and 40-year-old people who've been doing this for years and years, they just have no idea how to start. And they'll just ask me like 10,000 questions. And truthfully, it's kind of a pleasure because I feel like I had so many years of failure and mistakes and rejection. So the thing that's so beautiful about teaching is I could use all my mistakes and rejections, and kind of, put them into a formula to help other people not have to go through that pain, and the years of struggle. So in a way, it feels like it was all worth it. So it's kind of like, it feels kind of miraculous.